Hello, everyone, and good afternoon. I'm Heidi Heitkamp, one of the original founders of One Country Project, and I am just so thrilled. I'm so excited for you all to hear our next presentation from our keynote speaker, Audra Mulkern. She is a James Beard Award nominee, and we just had a conversation. I asked her about a restaurant. She looked at me, she goes, "No, this I got for my journalism." So she can tell you all about that, or we can do a little bit of deep dive on what that award was for. But she is a writer, a photographer. She's given TEDx speeches, and she's an international keynote speaker who is changing the way we look at how we see people who grow our food. She is the founder of the Female Farm Project. It's a multi-platformed and award-winning documentary project that chronicles the rise of women working in agriculture across the world. From in-depth stories, personal essays, photographic portraits, podcasts, and actively working to pass legislation on behalf of farmers and farm workers, the project has given a powerful voice to the fastest growing demographic in agriculture, the female farmer. In 2012, she stood in the middle of a farmer's market and kind of had an epiphany. She saw women everywhere, growing food, raising livestock, making cheese. They were stewarding a vibrant local economy, and they were on the forefront of the new food movement. The visibility of these female farmers made Audra question the gender stereotypes inherent in agriculture and prompted her to dig deeper. With a background at a major software company in business developing and marketing, she may seem to be kind of an unlikely candidate to become a leading voice and documentarian of the blooming and blossoming agricultural movement that we see today, this farm to table, women getting engaged and growing. But in many ways, it makes sense. She's created deep roots in a rural agricultural community and has witnessed widespread gender stereotyping and discrimination in her original industry, which is technology. And so, Audra, I am so excited to have you here. I'm so excited to listen to what you're up to now. You and I have had a chance to visit in the past, and I always feel so much more optimistic about the world having you explain the work that you're doing. So if you want to take it away from here, and then maybe we'll save maybe 5 minutes at the end for a little chit chat back and forth with you and me. So
that
go
sounds
ahead.
Great, thank you. I think we're going to show a trailer of the film right now.
His name is Francis Edward Mulkern.
She's plowing and cultipacking. Yeah, women were always doing this work.
It was more than a joke because it ended up that I did all physical labor.
We're in the middle of filming.
So take it away.
Well, as Senator Heitkamp mentioned, I'm Audra Mulkern. I am the founder of the Female Farmer Project, and she and I were just joking that I'm an accidental advocate. I live in Washington State in a rural farming community, which is shorthand for I have terrible internet connectivity. I'm a wife, mother of two. I'm the purchaser of the food of my household. So that means I'm the one who goes to market and tries to make the most nutritious decisions for my family. And that's actually where my story starts. Nearly 11 years ago, I was shopping at my local farmer's market and I noticed something. Behind every single farm table was a woman. Now, I know women farm. Most of these women were my neighbors and my friends. But there was something really special and different about that day. about that moment. And I've replayed it over and over in my head. Why had they suddenly become visible to me? So I went to the library to figure it out. And what I learned is that women are missing from the data, from the narrative, from the picture. It wasn't until the 1978 Census of Agriculture that the USDA even began to track gender. So up until 40 years ago, women farmers were not even counted. I began to ask, what happens when women go uncounted, when they're left out of the story, when they're not even in the picture? Now, we all know if you're not in the data, no one's thinking about you. Since then, I have visited and photographed and interviewed hundreds of women farmers across the country as they've driven tractors and mucked stalls as they've tended seedlings. I hoped my photographs would make them feel seen, but I also wanted everyone else, little girls who never dreamed they could be a farmer, and consumers who wondered who was growing their food, and policymakers who really needed to see their lives and their realities and challenges. I wanted to put them back in the picture. According to the 2017 Census of Agriculture, women farmers account for 36% of all farmers, 20% of primary farm operators, and 55% of all farms have at least one female producer. Yet very little is known about these women farmers and the economic circumstances of these farmers, because economists have been studying women in agriculture have primarily focused on the developing world. Women have largely been left out of the American agricultural narrative, but they have been there with strength and determination, with grit and grace, in fields and on tractors, and often with babies on their hips. I celebrate the fact that women have always farmed. However, the relationship between women and farming has been disrupted over time by culture and government policies and the male-dominated agricultural industry. But female farmers are also incredible disruptors, pushing back against these systems, paving the way for the future of food, and becoming the change makers of modern day US agriculture. The future of our food is rooted in supporting women in agriculture. Women across industries and politics are shattering glass ceilings, and agriculture is no exception. Women have become the fastest growing demographic in agriculture. But even a glance at agricultural leadership tells you that this is an industry that has placed women in the margins. I call this the grass ceiling, and we need to mow it down. Now, we have published in countless publications around the globe, placing women farmers on the cover of magazines and the front pages of newspapers and on the sides of city buses. I've shared their stories from stages in Milan and Paris. I've exhibited at the United Nations in New York and in Mexico City and the FAO building in Rome. My images are hanging on the walls of the USDA and in congressional offices. We have coached several farmers in writing their personal stories and helped them get published in national magazines. I've been invited to speak to major banks and the US Treasury. We have a podcast that was invited to record live in front of a global science conference. And we have listeners in our podcast in 50 countries, including India, Kuwait, Rwanda, Korea, and Russia. In 2016, we published a story about the farmer suicide crisis to an overwhelming response from farmers, consumers, and legislators who were determined to prioritize the well-being of America's agricultural workers. With Senator Heitkamp's help, we were able to pass both the Senate and House. We passed a marker bill called Farmers First. It included $50 million in funding and grant money for organizations who are working to provide life-saving assistance to America's farmers and farm workers. But there have been many small wins along the way, too. We passed similar legislation here in Washington state. We also published a piece about Black farmland loss and discriminatory lending practices. I've advocated and worked with Senators Baldwin and Tester on the expansion of broadband and increasing access to affordable quality childcare in rural communities. But I say all of this because I want you to know that agriculture is a uniter. Folks want to support the people who grow our food. They are realizing that farmers are our most important agricultural natural resource. So I'm just going to tell you about our friend Anastasia. She lives alone on a ranch in southern Arizona. She raises goats and grows garlic. I visited on a June day when the temperatures reached 110 degrees. The desert terrain and the weather are tough, but so is she. Just down the road from Anastasia lived Joe. 30 years ago, she and her husband, George, opened a butcher shop, which became the go-to facility for the neighboring farmers. After George passed away, Joe closed the shop. But when she met Anastasia, they began to dream about reopening together. However, on the very day that I visited, her well went dry for the first time ever. Despite their many efforts, they were unable to secure a small loan. And without that funding to dig a deeper well, these two women were forced to abandon their plans. For Joe and Anastasia, the loss was personal. Their story illustrates the fact that women have a harder time obtaining loans and credit. They're often told that their small loans aren't worth the time, or they're dismissed as hobby farms instead of the critical community resources that they are. For Joe and Anastasia's community, this loss reverberates. Fewer meat processing options, another community business lost, and a missed opportunity to transfer skill and knowledge from one generation to the next. Idzai immigrated from her native Zimbabwe to San Diego in 2002 with her husband and her 4 daughters. Her first order of business was to find land to farm and a good school for her girls. She began with a small 30 by 40 foot garden plot, and now she leases the backyards of 4 different homes in downtown San Diego. She's turning these urban yards into lush, productive, life-giving spaces. Idzai's days begin at 4 a.m. when she works an 8-hour shift as an airport shuttle driver. And then she works the rest of the day on the farm. Excuse me. Idzai's dream is to farm full-time, but for now, she depends on the steady income from the shuttle job, income which has put all 4 of her daughters through college. She's not alone. 2/3 of America's female farmers have a full-time job in addition to their farm, and not only for the income, but for healthcare benefits. Siri is a vegetable farmer here in Washington. About 14 years ago, she left a salaried job in public administration to start farming, a decision that she doesn't regret. She says that farming is a good life and a way to create and connect and contribute. But the profit margins are thin and the hours are erratic. I took this photograph years ago when she was pregnant with her second child. And now, with 2 young children, the lack of access to childcare remains a major hurdle to building up her farm business. In fact, childcare comes up repeatedly as I talk with women farmers. A University of Vermont study in 2015 found that nearly 61% of all farmers that were surveyed reported childcare problems. And it should be no surprise to anyone that women-led farms were most impacted. Siri cobbles together several part-time fixes to the childcare problem, but it isn't enough. And she yearns for the time to focus on business development and to advocate for informed farm policy. All of that gets lost in the scramble. Michelle is a 4th-generation farmer in Montana. She's farming primarily winter wheat and malt barley, safflower, sunflowers, corn, hay, barley, forage mix, and alfalfa. She has a big farm. And at the time of this photo, she was expecting her first child. She has two now. And she told me, "This is the only career I can think of that you are at the mercy of two uncontrollable factors, the markets and the weather. I cannot control the weather and have watched numerous times as hail destroyed my crops or have watched them wither in the field from drought. I cannot control the markets. Currently, commodity prices are in a significant slump, some sitting at or below the cost of my production. I cannot control global supply or what traders do or how strong the dollar is. It's a very difficult reality to accept, and it also adds to the risk. I could make all the right decisions and still lose crop to Mother Nature or lose money because of low market prices." Michelle was the first woman president on the executive board of the Montana Grain Growers Association, and she went on to serve in the National Association as well. Michelle told me that no one wants to be the person that causes a multi-generation farm to fail, whether by mismanagement or simple bad luck. It is a very real fear and a source of anxiety for many farmers. Everyone wants to add another generation of farmers to their family farm and name. She hopes every day that one of her children will become one of the fifth generation farmer ranchers. Michelle uses her public social media platform to openly share about her experiences with depression, and that since my visit, she has returned to a full-time job at Amazon in Washington State. She commutes back and forth between there and her farm in Montana. So much of farming is out of farmers' control, and mental health is tied to that in very precarious ways. Crop insurance is critical, and it's nearly impossible to farm these days without an off-farm job. But also, women are not taking seriously in ag, and Michelle had to fight for her seat at the table. I met Karen on a rainy day at the farmer's market in the South Bronx. I had to take an Uber to see her because there was just no convenient train service from where I was located. And I noticed from the car window as we were driving through that there were lots of corner markets advertising their specials, hot dogs and soda. This was my first glimpse into how a neighborhood in the middle of New York City could struggle with poverty, access to transportation, and how that creates a lack of access to fresh food. And all of that was just a few miles from some of the finest dining and farms in the world. In 1985, she had a vision of the empty and deserted lots of the South Bronx, that they would be filled with people growing food. It seemed like an impossible dream, but despite all of the odds and zoning restrictions, she made it happen. And many of those that are a part of her farming posse, as she calls them, were ladies in their 80s. But then she needed to get that produce into the hands of the community. So she started a weekly market, La Familia Verde, the Green Family. And she told me that their mission is, if you come to market hungry, you will not leave market hungry. You see, it would be easy to write the South Bronx off as a food desert, but it's inaccurate and it sugarcoats the problem. This is about poverty, or as Karen describes it, as food apartheid. She said that she eventually realized that she couldn't concentrate on the garden and market being about food alone, because there were so many things intersecting, that it also became about the well-being and health of her community. But also, by changing the language around the problem from food desert to food apartheid, a real conversation can begin. Nina lives in the town of Ajo, Arizona. Population about 4,000. It's a 2 hours drive from any major city center. This is a literal food desert in the middle of a desert. And still to this day, the only food stores in town are the Ace Hardware, the Circle K, and the Dollar General. In the center of town sits a copper mine, an ugly open pit, more than 1,000 feet deep and 1.5 miles across. The mine closed in the 1980s due to plummeting copper prices. The company people left. Stores closed, schools closed, and the aquifer poisoned with arsenic, jeopardizing the health of all who remained. Nina is the force behind the revival of a local Ajo food system. She spent 4 years working on the Tana Autumn Indian Reservation, apprenticing with farmers who were growing desert-adapted traditional crops, including 60-day corn and small oval-shaped tepary beans. In 2008, there were only 2 home gardeners growing food in the entire town. Today, there are more than 100 people growing gardens, many in this style of garden that she calls the waffle garden. And it's the opposite of a raised bed. They are dug deep into the soil so that the rain gets captured. The home gardeners are growing so much food that they were able to start a weekly farmers market. And she installed a farm and orchard in the center of a schoolyard in an abandoned school. She tore up and hauled away all of that blacktop and asphalt. And when I visited, she was hosting a planting party with the community. It was hot. It was about 115 degrees, and I was sure no one was going to show up. But they did. And about 50 people representing nearly every age group came. She taught them about the seeds and how they grow with only 1 rainfall. And that after they worked together to plant those beds, she cooked all of them a dinner with using those tepary beans. I really hated to peel away from this scene, this community of strangers and neighbors and friends. It brought new meaning to the word resilience and community to me. You see, I believe that only by listening to the stories from those on the front lines of food production that we can begin to envision and understand the policy changes necessary to support the women across this country who are working to bridge the gap. These women are essential thinkers and doers for the future of food. Their stories and perspectives are fundamental for understanding the current agrarian landscape. Not only do their stories acknowledge the many issues that threaten farming, a decrease in water supply, an increase in water or weather catastrophes, the pandemic and its effect on the supply chain, the globalizing of the agricultural marketplace, the incredible labor that women put in, not only in farming, but in second jobs and the invisible workload of home, hearth, and family. But their stories also demonstrate the expertise and innovation and resiliency of America's women in agriculture. I believe in the power of sharing their stories because it creates a stepping stone for understanding and demands space in an overarching narrative that left women behind. I advocate for mental health resources for farmers, rural broadband expansion, access to childcare, access to affordable credit, and collecting better data. I feel that those are among the biggest barriers to success for the people who produce our food. I'm excited every day to help contribute to the narrative of American agriculture that centers around the perspectives and contributions of women. I believe that they are the experts and essential in the imagining and implementation of our future food system. So I want to thank everyone for spending this time with me, and let's mow down that grass ceiling together.
Thank you so much for what a lovely presentation, but also it represents the real challenges. And I want to, you're working on this documentary. Can you kind of outline how you're telling the story of women in agriculture using that medium? And for those of us who are really excited to see it, can you give us a little bit more than what we saw in the preview?
Yeah, well, we feel like this is sort of a uniquely matrilineal retelling of agricultural history. So much of the stories that we're always told is a father-son passing of the farm. And we found 5 really unique farming families who passed the farm down mother to daughter. We have sort of picked 5 points along the history to find these women. I almost call them unicorns, but they're just so incredible with what they're doing. We have an indigenous farming family in Arizona that's reintroducing that tepary bean that I mentioned. Actually, I have some here sitting on my desk. They're this small, sort of almost lentil-sized bean that are desert adapted, and they grow on 1 rainfall. And they thought it was an extinct bean, actually, and she found the seeds in the adobe home that she grew up in, just a small jar, and was asked by the elders of the tribe to reintroduce the thing. So she is now actually growing it at commercial scale. It's an incredible production. And then we hop up to Pennsylvania, where we meet and actually, we don't even know how many generations her family's been farming. It's since time immemorial.
And very common in indigenous populations that women would be the farmers. I mean, that's true historically with indigenous
very much
people.
a matrilineal, matriarchal society, and women own the land, and they, were the farmers, and they owned the animals and the pelts and everything that came with that. They were that was the women's domain. That was women's work. And then we hop up to Pennsylvania, where we meet a 10th generation farmer who her family bought their land from William Penn. A really incredible story. She took over the farm when her mother passed away from brain cancer, unfortunately. But a really special story about, sort of stepping into her mother's boots, and how the farm was passed down through the mother side of the family. 4th generation women led. And then we go down to Georgia, where we meet a woman farmer who is 6th generation, who is farming the land that her great-great-great-grandfather purchased as an emancipated slave after the Civil War. So they've been able to hang on to the land all this time and are still farming it, which is, an incredible story. All of these stories are incredible. I get chills when I think about them. And then we head to Alaska, where we meet farming families, one of which our farmer who is in that trailer, she's kind of the star of our trailer, who's 102, and took advantage of the Homesteading Act of 1867 in Alaska in 1947. And she's the one who proved up the land. She's the one who did all the physical labor, and she has an incredible story to share. And then we end our story with a Hmong farming family here in Washington State, who she started growing as a very small child, I think 5 or 6 years old, who she grew poppies for the opium trade in Laos. And she was a refugee in Thailand for about a decade, and now she was sponsored into the United States in the 70s. And so she represents this really interesting immigrant story, where she went from farmers for the opium trade to flowers for the Pike Place market. So it's a really beautiful story that, covers, decades and continents and flowers to flowers.
It's so interesting to me. I've had the opportunity to tour family-run farms and dairies in Africa, but I was just recently on a train coming back from Ukraine into Poland, and I was struck looking out the window. There are no backyards. There are back gardens. All along the way, gardens. And you see, I think in particular, immigrant people who have never had access to land the way we have access to land, saying, look, I've got this backyard. I'm going to turn it into something that will produce food for my family, but also maybe expand my opportunity to raise some additional revenue. So when you're looking at the movement and you're looking at the number of women coming into farming and certainly the farmers markets, how many of them are not at commercial scale? They are just backyard farmers who are now finding their way onto into these kinds of venues to sell the excess produce.
Well, according to, I don't know what it is for the 2017, but the 2012, I'm sure it's going to be the same for the 2017 census, that women typically farm less than 40 acres. And a lot of that is because they're first generation farmers. They don't have the privilege of being passed down, a large farm that's already, been in the family for generations, and that there's no mortgage to pay. Many of them start out at, these, there's a lot of these organizations have started putting together, they'll buy a farm and then they'll invite many farmers to come, and they'll each get an acre. And then they will all contribute together, by paying into the fund for all of the, equipment and the tractors and all of that, because it's so expensive to get any of that. The land and all of that's so expensive. So these first generation farmers don't really have access to, the land. They don't have access to the capital. And so they are sort of creating this new world of farming in backyards, like, Itzai, who is leasing the backyards of 4 homes. And, that's how she gets enough land to produce enough to make it worthwhile financially for her. But that's just got to be incredibly tough because they're not in succession to each other. She has to drive all over.
Yeah, at one point I think John Deere was selling more small scale tractors than large scale tractors to basically accommodate this emerging market. And the one thing we know, the smaller you are, the more specialized your crops are and the more specialized they have to be. But one of the things you and I, Audra, were talking about before is we have a farm program that works pretty well for your farmer in Montana. But for specialty crops, for fruits and vegetables, there isn't the level of safety net that you see for large commodity farmers. And, I think that's going to be a growing issue and a growing concern as we kind of look at the next farm bill. What are going to be, how are we seeing the people that you are documenting here, which is, I love when you said, I hadn't, all of a sudden I went to farmer's market and I saw people the way I hadn't seen them before. I had seen these, agricultural entrepreneurs who are, doing honey and they're doing flowers and they're doing small scale specialty crops. And, they're adding a few arts and crafts to, in their spare time when they're watching TV at night before they fall asleep. Maybe they're putting together some wonderful pot holders. And, we've all been there. Yeah. We've all been to these places. But what I loved about the way you're presenting their stories is these are business people. They're not hobbyists. These are people whose family is dependent on what they're doing. And, we have to have people see them. If you look kind of into the future, as you are a big part of documenting this movement, documenting this opportunity, when we look at like the large land grant colleges, they're doing their research on new varietals that are going to be, more insulated from the super, weeds that are coming. They're looking at climate on large scale. And the former Secretary of Agriculture famously said, "Get big or get out." Right. When he was talking, and I like Sonny, and I think there was a reason why he said that. Which it's becoming non-economic for anyone under 5,000 acres to farm these large commodities. But aren't we really missing an opportunity to support more diversity in our food chain, and more locally grown in our food chain if we don't support the people that you see and that I see at these farmer markets at emerging as new agricultural leaders?
Yeah, it was really that epiphany when I stood in that market. And I thought, holy cow, all of this time, I have not been thinking about these women, these farmers, as landowners, as business owners, as employers in, this region. I was, very insulated, like thinking in terms of like they were, not business owners, I don't think. And then I noticed that everybody else was thinking about them in the same way. My mayor in town would host, a roundtable of Main Street businesses, but not include the farmers who were the major employers of our region. And it was definitely a shift. This was about 11 years ago. So I've been working really hard to help people create that shift that, yes, these are people who are, serious business owners, and the banks should be taking them very seriously. And just because they don't want a, $300,000 loan, they want a $30,000 loan, it should be worth their time regardless, because of, what an impact their small business can make. And we've discovered that during the pandemic, when it was the small farms that sort of bridged that gap, because, we saw so many, farms having to plow the potatoes under and dump milk because there just wasn't the, big commercial markets, but it was the small farms that sort of stepped in and bridged that gap.
Well, you and I were talking. You said you've made presentations to, I don't want to name the bank because I don't know that I remember, but to large financial institutions who are very interested in how they can help support the work of these new agricultural entrepreneurs and growers, right?
Yeah. I mean, really just such a privilege to be able to share these stories and open their eyes to, what, I like to say, ignore these women at your peril. Yeah. They're coming on and they're coming on strong, and they're going to be who you want to be, paying a little bit of attention to.
Well, if you grew up where I grew up and with my family was just one generation off the farm. I always tell people I spent a summer picking 5 acres of cucumbers. And if you think that's easy work, you should do it. And we were just kids. And, my grandfather planted 5 acres with the idea that it would augment his Social Security, but they had to be picked every day. He was fortunate that he had a lot of grandkids. Otherwise, it wouldn't have worked out very well for him. But I think you also, when you have those experiences growing up, you know how hard the work is. But you also are not intimidated. I mean, if you said, here's a half an acre, go plant a garden, I could do that because that's how I was raised. But I think that this is a connection that we're losing as more and more people think cucumbers, are what happens in the grocery store and not what happens on the vine. And so this movement to me is also so critical to connect people to the source of their food. And I think it's interesting. I don't think about it when I have when I buy cornflakes, but I sure think about it when I buy a head of lettuce. What it took to get that head of lettuce in my shopping basket. So, how do you think it will change, that this movement will change America's connection to the food that they eat?
I really like that a lot of my urban farmers stay in urban farming because they feel like they are farming in the public gaze. They, are showing, the production, the level of production that it takes, how much actual work, sun up to sundown, even on an urban farm. And that, creates a narrative for people who are seeing it happen because, like you said, so many generations removed. I think we're something like 5 generations removed on average from the farm. So many children, don't know that you pull a carrot from the ground. They think it's the small little tiny things that you get, in a bag. I think that we are limiting ourselves by half by not bringing in this other half. The women and the small farms that are doing this work, there's a lot of cultural and traditional knowledge that lives there. A lot of these folks are, immigrants and have traditional farming methods that could be some of the answers that we're looking for on a larger scale. And, women in particular are very sort of the strategies that they employ, to cope with these limited resources that they have could, definitely inform sustainable development and, those strategies.
Well, I mean, if you take my example of the backyards in Ukraine, you look out the backyard and you say, I don't know with certainty that I am going to be able to feed my family. So I'm sure this is generational as well, but there's a certain necessity in times of conflict to provide that food. And I always say when we talk about protectionism, which I spent a lot of time dealing with when I was in the Senate, the rules against importation of American lentils, and we grow a lot of edible beans here. And, why is that? And I said, because they're only one generation from knowing what it was like to be hungry. and knowing the importance of growing locally, of having that supply chain that is more resilient and not dependent on importation. But if you look at the kind of opportunities for recognition, it's not big. It is it's niche. It's like, okay, well, that's nice. As opposed to actually seeing people in a business sense and seeing people being serious about this. And I want to transition to your work with mental health, because I think one thing that we learned from the pandemic is that connectivity, that self-worth that we get from being with other people. And we know that farming can be very isolating. Not only is it challenging because of weather, challenging because of markets, challenging because it's a lot of hard work, but it also is kind of lonely. I mean, you aren't going into the office and spending a lot of time around the water cooler talking about succession, right? You're in the tractor by yourself, or you're weeding your garden by yourself. So how do you connect and see people that you've been with? How do you connect them with mental health services, and which recognize the unique nature of the challenges of farmers?
Right. I think that's an important thing to say, is that there is definitely a cultural piece to that a lot of mental health providers didn't understand. My co-creator, she was a farmer herself and suffered from depression. She remembered being in $1 million worth of debt and calling a therapist, and the therapist, going, "What? You're $1 million in debt?" And it just made her feel worse, right? Not understanding that that's actually very typical, and then saying, "Well, why don't you just take a weekend away from the farm?" Well, who's going to milk the goats if I leave? That sort of cultural understanding was very rare to find for farmers. And so we spent some time in Kansas and Iowa, sitting across the tables of farmers who suffered from mental health struggles. And, a lot of it came down to the fact that they really just didn't have broadband and access. They didn't have a local newspaper anymore. They only had access to one, cable network stream, and they just were finding themselves further and further sort of away from everything else that was going on. They and even just go to a therapist in town, that felt embarrassing for them. They wanted to drive to someone who didn't know their truck, if it was being pulled into a driveway somewhere. So they, would have to drive 2-3 hours away, or any kind of healthcare was, such a drive for them. They couldn't do it over, this kind of situation with them, telehealth. So that was a struggle for them, and it is very lonely. And I think that's the thing that I really came away with, is it's very lonely. And then you go into town, and the towns are just empty because there's just nobody left, because everybody went big. So now there's 5 farmers where there were 50.
I think that's a really interesting point. I think about my mother-in-law. My husband grew up on a small family farm. I grew up in a town of 90 people. Both of my grandparents were farmers on both sides, and there go the cucumber growing experience. But I was thinking about my mother-in-law, Marge, and, when she raised chickens, everybody brought their chickens to her house. She had it all set up. So butchering was done together. And then the homemakers would be together. And then you would run your 4-H club together. And so there was so much more community, rural community, than there is now. And in part, when you said most of the people you meet do not just rely on agriculture for their livelihood, they have off-farm jobs, they're doing other things. And so many people are that kind of community that went with the production, whether it was canning, whether it was gardening, whether it was 4-H showing, bragging about what you've done, that's all gone. That is not that's not available to a lot of the young women that you're working with. They're out there alone.
They are, and they're working hard to try to build that community. But it's interesting, they've had to do it virtually. I know some farmers who get together for virtual coffee. They have used Instagram and Facebook to connect with each other and then become friends. And now they have virtual coffee dates because there's nowhere to go, or it's too far to go.
Well, there's a project in Minnesota. A woman started it, Teresa Kittredge, and it's called 100 Rural Women. And she started out just networking, and it's almost all virtual. They do a lot of, you should run for the school board. You should, a lot of leadership training. But think about, if you don't have access to broadband, it's even more isolating. So that opportunity won't even be available to you.
Yeah. I mean, that broadband thing, I just keep coming back to it. And we've talked about it a lot over the last 2 days too, that how critical it is. It's critical in so many different ways. And during COVID, it really just, brought it to sharp relief. People needed access to school. People needed access to healthcare. People needed access to the marketplace, and they didn't have it.
So if any of our listeners want to see, the work that you're doing, this is multi-platform, where would they go, Audra?
Well, they could
to follow up with your project.
Femalefarmerproject.org is my female farmer project site. A lot of that is I'm starting to expand it and bring in other folks to help provide more content and building it into more of a platform versus, me providing all of the content. And some of the things are sort of, put aside right now while I'm focusing on the film, which is womensworkdoc.org. And that's where you can see the trailer. And I don't know if we'll have a chance to show the 60-second trailer here again with sound, but you can see it on Women's Work Doc or womensworkdocumentary.org.
Well, and I wish you just so much goodwill. So when it's released, now you do have some regional release time for the full film, right? But right. Working on a national release.
Yes, we're working on national PBS release. We have to have something for them to see first. But they did reach out to us versus us reaching out to them. So that was great news that they are interested in providing a platform for this kind of content. So it's exciting.
And so there may be some young women who are saying, I want to do that. That's what I want to do. What resources could you point people to network with some of the women that you've been able to see and document here? But where would people go if they said, I'm really curious about how I participate in this economy?
I think the podcast is a great place to start. There's a lot of, really sage advice from experienced women farmers who've been in it for a long time and how they built their businesses. And I love that the podcast is a platform that farmers can take on the go. That's so much of what I heard when I started this, is that they needed something in their ears when they were in the tractors, when they were mucking, the barns, that they could take this and, a transportable sort of inspiration and educational podcast. And, I think it's for everybody. I don't think just farmers can listen to it. I think there's a lot of really interesting stuff there, a lot of wisdom. And then there's a lot of great organizations. Farm Aid just put together a big collective of like a database of all farming organizations in the country, and you can just search on search terms of what you are looking for, and there's, it pops up with all these different organizations that you can research. And then I really love the National Farmers Union Beginning Farmers Program. It's free, and you apply, and I think they take 25, 30 farmers every year and train them, and it's really great. And there's a lot of local regional programs like that as well, but at a national level, those are great places to start.
Well, I'm going to issue a warning to all the young people out there who think that that this is the thing for them. It's really hard work.
But rewarding.
Oh, absolutely. And I have to laugh because as we're speaking, my husband is out in his half-acre garden right now because, we found out, and this is something else for those of us who are hobbyists. We were able to take our produce to Great Plains Food Bank. They would take any amount of vegetables. And so if you want to be a producer and there's no way you can pass off that extra zucchini to your friends one more time, the food banks will take this produce. And so you could really help alleviate a lot of hunger by contributing that way as well. And so
grow a row.
Yeah. For those of us who grew up growing, whether it was our gardens or whether it was watching our families raise wheat and corn and soybeans and edibles, this is, I think we all know that there needs to be transition in terms of who the workforce is, and we need to have more resiliency. We can't just always expect to get bigger and bigger and to have a food supply chain that has the resiliency to withstand something like the pandemic. So let's put our heads around how we can help on a policy basis, and we'll continue to think about it here at One Country Project. Thanks so much, Audra. I want to thank you. This has been a wonderful opportunity to see people that aren't usually seen, and I want to tell people now, as we end this, you'll be put back into the lobby and you'll have a chance to talk about paid family leave, which along with daycare is a critical issue for so many of these young women who are trying to make ends meet in rural America. So thank you so much, Audra. I can't wait to see the whole film.